This is my video about how good extra turns are in every card game. Taking an extra turn is an effect that is as old as card games itself, being printed as an original effect all the way back on Time Walk and Magic the Gathering's Alpha set. The basic idea of the card is it lets you perform a second turn after the turn in which you cast the Time Walk, meaning you get to take 2 turns in a row. It can also sometimes be phrased as target player skips a turn, such as on the 6 Shinobi here, which makes your opponent skip their next turn, functionally giving you 2 turns in a row, the same as with Time Walk. Original Time Walk is one of the original Magic the Gathering Power 9 and is very obviously very undercosted. The more modern costing is a 5 cost card like Time Warp here, which costs 5 mana to give you an extra turn, very similar to Hearthstone's Time Warp, which is the exact same thing. Taking an extra turn is a very potent and very obviously powerful effect. Most players will tell you that taking an extra turn after their initial turn is obviously very strong, but how strong is it specifically in every card game? First off, Magic the Gathering. So, how good is taking an extra turn in Magic the Gathering with a spell like Time Warp? Even with the high priced cost of a 5 mana sorcery, a card like Time Warp is still super broken and a very powerful effect to use in Magic the Gathering. Even though they increase the mana more than double from the original Time Walk onto Time Work, making the card cost twice as much, they still even increase the pricing even more for different Time Walk style effects that are present in Standard, such as All Run's Epiphany here. The most obvious powerful thing that an extra turn spell gives you in Magic is the ability to double up on effects, the most common of these being powerful Planeswalker effects, which you are normally only allowed to activate once each turn, but if you have an extra turn, you can activate them an additional time, doubling up on the value from your Planeswalker. You obviously also gain all the natural benefits of going on your turn, being drawing a card, untapping your lands, and getting an extra combat step. But with extra things that give you once a per turn benefit, like Planeswalkers here, it is really, really easy to take advantage of Time Walk spells, giving you many, many times where you can not only protect your Planeswalkers from being attacked because your opponent doesn't get a turn, but you also get an additional count on each of their Planeswalker abilities. This effect is so strong that it is not only contained to blue. There are many red cards which give you an extra turn, but they always have the downside at the end of it of despite the fact that they have a very low cost, you lose the game at the end of your additional turn. This common red element flips the turn spell on its head. So it's not a card that is granting you a lot of value over time, letting you draw additional cards and untap your lands. It basically is just there to give you an additional combat and additional untap step to try to kill your opponent in one final push. It really goes to show how powerful an effect is when you have to increase the mana cost by an absolutely gargantuan amount to have it be even remotely fair. And if you want to keep the lower mana cost, you literally have to staple lose the game at the end of your turn onto the card for it to be a card that is fair to play with. However, the other thing that Magic the Gathering cards that take extra turns do very often is they end up going infinite completely on accident. After all, if you can find basically any way to loop these spells, you will simply take all the turns in the game and be able to win because your opponent will no longer be allowed to play any more cards. One of the most powerful things that you can do is take multiple extra turns in a row using a card like Snapcaster Mage to flash back an extra turn spell, meaning that not only did you get the extra turn from casting it the first time, you can use that extra turn to gain yourself an additional turn after that, and then just keep going and taking so many turns that your opponent will never be able to catch up. It is also extremely easy to accidentally have infinite 2 card combos come up with cards which grant additional turns. The most obvious of these is the card Time Vault, which has the initial design idea of you having to skip one of your turns and then you can tap the Time Vault to gain an extra turn after this one. However, combine Time Vault with any card that allows you to untap an artifact multiple times, and you can immediately see how Time Vault becomes a problem, giving you all of the turns for the rest of the game. There are even some infinite combos in Magic which let you take all of your opponent's turns by abusing the card Mindslaver, which has the 4 mana sack ability to take control of target player during their next turn. If you combine this card with a card like Academy Ruins or something that lets you rebuy an artifact multiple times, you can simply Mindslaver your opponent, stopping them from doing anything on their turn, and then take it to your turn and rebuy the Mindslaver over and over again, once again taking control of all the turns for the rest of the game. This effect is so powerful they even managed to print a 1 card infinite combo to take all the turns in the game in Nexus of Fate. Nexus of Fate, an iconic standard playable card, says take an extra turn after this one. But if Nexus of Fate is put into a graveyard, such as when you cast it, you simply shuffle it back into your deck instead. Meaning that if Nexus of Fate is the only card that is left in your deck, you can cast Nexus of Fate, put it in your graveyard, shuffle in, go to your next turn, draw a turn, and you will simply redraw the Nexus of Fate. Meaning that you can take an infinite number of turns with just 1 card. Combine this with literally anything that does actually anything to win the game in any aspect, and Nexus of Fate is the kind of card that will easily break the game if you can do the simple task of drawing your whole deck and getting up to 7 mana. All of these cards really go to show that taking extra turns is not only powerful on a micro level of just gaining a small advantage, but is also super powerful on a macro level of being your strategy to win the game. Next up is Yu-Gi-Oh! So how good is taking an extra turn in Yu-Gi-Oh! Using a card like the 6 Shinobi here to skip your opponent's next turn? The answer is it's pretty horrible. Cards like Teller Knight, Tolmaeus here, and the 6 Shinobi are some of the very few cards that are actually printed with ways to skip your opponent's next turn. Both of them require an absolutely gargantuan amount of monsters to activate. Tolmaeus requires you to have 7 materials attached to it to skip your opponent's next turn, and the 6 Shinobi requires you to have literally all of your zones featuring a 6 samurai monster of a different attribute. Both of these massive costs make it so that way these cards see very, very little play outside of Tolmaeus, which doesn't see any play for its skip turn effect at all. This really overshadows the fact that there's a super duper strong effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you could consistently skip your opponent's turn, it would be really, really easy to kill your opponent in almost any scenario because the effect is really strong, but it's simply printed on cards that have way too high a cost to activate. Arcana Force the World here, the only really playable version of these types of effects, allows you to skip your opponent's turn and is the only time I've really seen a card that is meaningfully used to skip your opponent's next turn. It's really, really hard to get out, being a very large monster that you have to jump through some hoops to actually get into play. And at the end of it all, you do have to flip a coin to actually get the ability to skip your opponent's turn. The main idea of the Arcana Force monsters is they have this card Light Barrier, which lets you choose which side of the coin flip you actually want, meaning that it is actually relatively viable to get the world out and actually skip your opponent's turn if you build your entire deck around doing that effect. The main thing, though, is that skipping your opponent's turn is kind of just broken by concept in Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game. All of the extra turn effects I'm going to talk about in this video give you an extra combat step, and the combat step is one of the most powerful things in Yu-Gi-Oh!, meaning that you can attack your opponent directly or attack monsters directly with any monster you want, meaning that the aggressor has a lot of advantage. Being able to gain an additional battle phase is something that's relatively rare in Yu-Gi-Oh! As well, because being able to attack your opponent multiple times is super duper strong, especially because you don't have a battle phase on the first turn of the game, meaning that if you could get to a second turn of the game without giving your opponent a chance to do anything, you could get that initial battle phase and immediately kill your opponent before they could do literally anything. This style of FTK, where you kill your opponent before they get to take any turn, is generally not recommended in any card game, and especially in Yu-Gi-Oh! A card like Mass Driver sits on the ban list for basically forever because of its ability to kill your opponent before they get the chance to normal summon literally anything. This is the main idea behind a card like Arcana Force the World. The main combo when you're playing the Arcana Force deck is you want to get the world out, skip your opponent's first turn while you go first, meaning they can't set up literally any defense to stop you, and then you immediately kill them on your additional turn by just beating them to death with a bunch of big statted monsters. This makes it so that way these style of skip the turn effects can never truly be meta, because if the metagame was revolving around cards which skip your opponent's initial turn in the game, a lot of the games would come down to just who can go first and end up killing their opponent on the very early turns of the game before the opponent can set up a defense, which is definitely not what you want your card game to be about. An effect that gives you an extra turn is simply too strong to print into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! At any playable level. I can't imagine them printing a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card that gives you an extra turn that isn't either completely unplayable or completely dominant in the game, meaning that this is a design space that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Designers should generally shy away from. Magic the Gathering's red version of these extra turn effects, which force you to lose the game after you cast the spell and go to that extra turn, would simply be too powerful to print in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because in Yu-Gi-Oh! You only need one turn to win the game and usually kill your opponent. So even if stapling literally lose the game onto an effect would be too strong for Yu-Gi-Oh!, it seems like the kind of thing that I can't ever imagine seeing print into the card game in any meaningful extent. Now for Pokemon. So in Pokemon, how good is taking an extra turn on a card like Dialga GX here, whose timeless attack lets you take an extra turn after this one? Surprisingly, the answer is it's just okay. It's actually a pretty fair and balanced effect in Pokemon. Similarly to Yu-Gi-Oh!, this is because they've attached all the extra turn effects to very, very limited versions of attacks, such as Dialga GX here, who has the GX attack, which you are only allowed to perform once per game. Similarly, a card like Togepi, Cleffa, and Igglybuff allows you to take an extra turn after this one by using their Supreme Puff GX attack. However, the attack, unlike Timeless GX, doesn't do any damage, meaning in order for it to have any meaningful impact on the game, you would either need a card that you can use on your turn that has a massive impact if you're doing it twice in a row, or you will have to enable its 14 fairy type energy requirement on the card to shuffle your opponent's Pokemon from their bench into their deck, which is, I don't think I need to say, very, very unviable in a card game to get 14 energy attached to your one Pokemon. Even when it isn't featured on this once per game style attack, though, it always has an inherent restriction, such as on Medicham V. Yoga Loop has one of the lowest costs we've seen of all these taken extra turn attacks, only costing 2 colorless energy, some of the easiest that is to enable with double colorless energy. However, Yoga Loop also does the lowest amount of impact on the game compared to all of these other effects, only doing 2 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, and it requires that Pokemon to get knocked out by the attack to take the additional turn, meaning that it actually requires a lot of setup on the trainer's part to force Yoga Loop to work in order to actually be able to get the attack off and take the extra turn. They also intelligently put the clause on Yoga Loop, meaning that you can't use it twice in a row. This way, you can't simply take all the turns in the game. If you end up Yoga Looping one of your opponent's Pokemon, you can't set up another Yoga Loop on your next turn and just go and take all the turns for the rest of the game. This is typically the thing that keeps the attacks on the Pokemon that grant extra turns in relative balance. Either they have a really, really high cost, such as Timeless GX costing 5 energy, or Dialga V-Star's Star Cronus attack costing 5 energy to take an extra turn, or if their cost is really, really low, it has a very, very low damage cap, meaning it doesn't have that large an impact on the game when you actually do get that extra turn, or it requires a ton of setup for that effect to actually be meaningful. I think it's really interesting, though, that this effect is still workable in Pokemon. Obviously, taking an extra turn with such high cost is difficult, but there are still playable versions of decks that run these cards and end up taking the extra turn being a part of their core strategy. The most playable version we've seen of this effect is Dialga Origin V-Star's Star Cronus attack, which does a large 220 damage for its once per turn Star Cronus attack and lets you take an extra turn, meaning that not only are you piling on a good amount of damage, but you're also getting another turn where you can pile on additional damage, use additional supporters, etc. In spite of the large cost, the attack is very, very powerful and is definitely worth all of the setup that you would have to go through to get that powerful Dialga attacker into your active spot with the 5 energy to perform the Star Cronus attack. Decks using different supporting cards, such as Batang here, allowing you to get basic energy from your deck and attach it to your metal Pokemon in any way you like, allow you to power up Pokemon like Dialga V-Star relatively easily, allowing you to use its very powerful attacks on early turns in the game. The most powerful reason behind the fact that Star Cronus is a good attack that allows you to take an extra turn is the fact that multi-prize turns are very, very highly valued in the Pokemon TCG. If you are behind on the prize race and your opponent is knocking out Pokemon faster than you can, being able to take an extra turn so that way you can take one knockout on your first turn and then an additional knockout on your second turn is extremely powerful and something that a lot of decks want to be able to do in the card game. A card seeing a ton of play here, Dusknoir, allows you to take multi-price turns by putting 13 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. However, if you do, you have to give your opponent a prize card by knocking out your own Dusknoir. It's really powerful to be able to take multi-price turns, either pull ahead further if you're already ahead with Dusknoir, or have a cheeky play where you can pull back by knocking out multiple multi-price Pokemon in one go using the Curse Blast attack. One thing that taking an extra turn does that almost no other effect in the game can do, though, is let you double up on valuable supporters on both of your additional turns. A card like Boss's Order already sees a ton of play in many decks, but in decks that take additional turns, it is even more powerful, being able to pull your opponent's Pokemon up multiple times in a row, getting multiple important knockouts on your opponent, and being able to cripple them to a large extent after taking an additional turn. I think the Pokemon Company has done an excellent job balancing the fact that taking an extra turn feels like a really powerful effect and is really meaningful, but also by attaching high enough cost to the effect that the effect is something that you have to build most of your deck around, and yet it is still worth it when you actually get to pull it off, take the extra turn, take a multi-price knockout, use multiple supporters, and get a huge lead out of using one powerful V-Star attack. Now for Hearthstone. So how good is taking an extra turn in Hearthstone? Using a card like Time Warp here, which lets you take an extra turn for 5 mana. The answer is, much like Magic, it is insanely broken. The card Time Warp is actually not a card you're allowed to put in your deck. It's locked behind the quest, Open the Waygate. This is the nerf version of Open the Waygate as well, requiring you to cast 8 spells that didn't start in your deck, as opposed to the original version, which forces you to only cast 6 spells that didn't start in your deck, which is already a pretty high cost, as you have to play cards in your deck that discover additional cards, allowing you to play cards that weren't in your deck at the beginning. The thing Time Warp mainly did in those decks was have an easy combo setup. By being able to take an additional turn after one, you can pretty easily set up a board to kill your opponent, take an extra turn, and then immediately attack your opponent for a large amount of damage or perform some sort of spell combo using the additional mana granted to you on the extra turn. To highlight the fact that Time Warp is so powerful, a card like Enter the Lost City, recently printed in the newest Ungoro set, says that you have to survive 10 turns and gives you Latrovis, Gaze of the City. His battle cry says that you get 2 Journey to Ungoro quest rewards and you shuffle all the other rewards into the deck. However, the only reward that you really care about of all of the versions of the old quest is Time Warp. All the other ones are just way, way worse. The power of being able to take an additional turn for only 5 mana is way better than setting your life to 40 or summoning a large 8/8 that shuffle cards into your deck. The only reason that this card sees any play at all is the fact that Time Warp is such a broken card that you're willing to put a card in that gives you a small chance of having Time Warp added to your hand and a guaranteed fact that you'll end up with Time Warp in your deck to win the game at some point. And while Time Warp was the first time they printed this effect into Hearthstone and was obviously super powerful, there are alternate cards which also give you the ability to take extra turns in the game. First, we have the classic unplayable one that has a massive cost that you can never refill in Temporis. It turns out that taking an extra turn is really good. So the way you want to balance the effect is to give your opponent an extra turn first, meaning that they can do all the broken stuff using an extra turn before you can. Turns out this isn't really an effect that you want to put in your deck. Turns out giving your opponent an extra turn first makes it way, way worse when you take the extra turn. Unlike Temporis, however, having a massive cost, the cost on Time Winners Zarimi is much, much lower. This way lower cost of only having you have to play 8 dragons on your turn, which is also nerfed like Enter the Waygate, originally being 5 dragons on your turn to take an extra turn, is way, way more achievable for most priest decks. Zarimi is a different version of a Time Warp style effect, being a minion, meaning that it is more vulnerable to disruption in your opponent's hand, meaning if Zarimi is too good, you can play cards like Dirty Rat to try to pull it out and stop your opponent from comboing. But in general, Zarimi is a lot more powerful because the ability to play dragons is something that most priest decks kind of want to do anyway and isn't as large of a cost as having to put the quest in your mage deck and being able to play many, many spells from outside the game. Whilst the mage deck generally focused on performing a combo after taking an extra turn, as mage has many, many combo cards in its class identity and has a lot more spells, priest decks have a lot more minions in them, especially because you're putting many dragons in your deck, meaning that doubling up on combat was a lot more important for a card like Zarimi. A card like Clay Matriarch already completes a large amount of the dragon enabling of Zarimi, as the miniaturized keyword will let you play 2 dragons for the price of 1, but it also summons additional dragons with 4/4 and elusive, meaning that generally a Zarimi combo deck will simply play down a large board of minions, play down the Zarimi, and get multiple attacks in on the opponent's face, easily killing them in one fell swoop. You may have noticed some lessons learned from Hearthstone from the previous card games, however, as if you haven't noticed, Zarimi and Into the Waygate both have the once per game clause stapled onto them. Okay, well, they didn't exactly learn this lesson by looking at Magic the Gathering decks, which take all the turns and deciding they don't want that in the game. What actually happened is they actually printed a card called Grey Sage Parent, which would let you double up on Into the Waygate. This card got nerfed on both halves, both Into the Waygate not being repeatable in the game, but also Grey Sage Parent got knocked up to 6 or more cost, meaning you can't double up Into the Waygate because of how much it was ruining the game, being able to take multiple turns in a row by playing Grey Sage Parent after Grey Sage Parent, taking all the turns in the game. I think it's pretty obvious if you look at the cards that give you additional turns, except for Temporis, which has a massive downside. They've both been nerfed multiple times from multiple different angles and have broken the game in multiple different ways extremely easily. This all goes to show that I think that taking an extra turn in Hearthstone has to be treated with extreme care to not immediately break the game, because getting an additional combat step or getting an additional turn worth of mana is simply way too powerful to print into the game without some large downside or large cost of setup. To end off here, extra turn spells feel super duper powerful. They felt powerful all the way back in Alpha when you could pay 2 mana to take the effect, and even being printed at 5 mana nowadays, they are still a super powerful effect that feels really, really cool to use. The only real issue is it doesn't feel very fair or fun for your opponent when you take the additional turn and then your opponent is forced to wait even longer for you to end your turn, or more than likely simply just lose the game after you cast the take an extra turn effect. If a card like Arcana Force the World was a little bit better, it would pretty easily break the game, meaning that it has kind of a necessity for these cards to be bad and unplayable in order for them to kind of feel fair in the game. But by having cards like Diago V-Star in your game that have a massive cost, it actually makes it for a really interesting design, where taking the extra turn feels like a big payoff that you had to do a lot of work to get, but is actually relatively rewarding when you actually get to do it and feels deserved from your opponent because you let them set up to that point where they can get off their extra turn attack. But even when you put a large cost, like playing 8 dragons or something, onto your extra turn spell, I think it really shows that the mechanic never really feels that fair. Even if you go through a lot of hoops and your opponent can acknowledge that your deck is built around an effect and that had a lot of work put into it to make it, it still doesn't feel that fair when your opponent is actually taking that other turn against you and getting to do double the stuff that you get to do in one turn cycle. Whilst taking an extra turn is definitely a lot of fun for the player that gets to do it, I think you need to be extremely cautious when printing this type of effect into your game, because for the other player, it is oftentimes just a loading screen for them, waiting for their opponent to find some way to kill them on their extra turn. Meaning that even though it's a great effect, I think most card games should generally shy away from it or be very, very cautious when printing it into their game. And that's the video. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this from me. And let me know your thoughts on extra turns down in the comments below. Do you think they're great? Do you think that you should add them to more games? Do you think there's something that should be shied away from? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks for watching.